Hello, and welcome to our session, History, Winners Write It, Leaders Learn From It, a conversation with Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. I'm Ed Pena, Executive Vice President and Treasurer at Liberty Mutual, and I'm excited that Liberty has agreed to serve as co-signature sponsor for the Black Men in Leadership Conference. And it is my great pleasure to be sharing the stage with Eddie. Before we start, I'd like to encourage everyone to punch in their questions into the chat. We'll be looking out for those over the course of our conversation. We only have 42 minutes here, so I want to get us right to it. And bringing in Eddie here. So Eddie, you are truly a man for all seasons. You're a New York Times bestselling author, a Morehouse graduate, the chair of Princeton University's Department of AFAM Studies, a podcast host, and so much more. Your achievements and accomplishments are way too many to name in our time here today, but I wanted to take a step back and invite you to please share a little bit of your origin story. And in looking back at your life, were there any early signs and influences that led you to become who you are today?
Well, first of all, it's such a delight to be here, to be in conversation with you, Brother Ed. And it's such a wonderful question to begin our dialogue. You know, I'm a country boy from Mississippi, born and raised on the coast. My parents grew up with us. My mother had her first baby in the 9th grade, had to drop out of high school. My dad left home early to go fight in the Vietnam War in the Navy. And basically they grew up with their kids. So I grew up in a working class household. Father came home from Nam and got a job at the post office. So, that's high cotton back in the day. No books in the house. The only thing that was being read was the newspaper. The only thing that was expected was excellence. And it was demanded and it was maintained by fear. So I was deathly afraid of my father. But I grew up in a household of love. So in so many ways, I've been trying to figure out, how did this all happen? Because I'm the first male to go to college in my family. And I mean, my immediate family, across the board. And so it's grace. But I do know this, though. I think my father, whom we look just alike, right? Insisted that, I dream expansive dreams. He would say it in the crudest of ways, but he would say, Moss Point has nothing for you. Imagine yourself broadly and expansively. And so they gave me space, even though they didn't understand what the hell I was doing or who I was. And then I had teachers who did the same thing, people who noticed something and just gave me space to try to reach for something. And so I ran away from home, Brother Ed, basically at 16 to go to college. I wanted to get away from it, my dad. And so I ran away from home. Instead of going into the streets, I went to school, because Morehouse had an early admit program that had started at World War II, during World War II. And it was at Morehouse where they took the coal and they compressed it and helped make me who I am today. So it was there that it happened. But my dad and my mom put the seeds in, but they were growing up with us,
The themes of family and the importance of family in our lives and for our culture, definitely resonate with me and has come up in a couple of the sessions today. And I think I heard you sprinkle some of those kernels in there in your conversation, but to drill in on that point a little bit more, what was it that you learned or gleaned from your family that really kind of sits with you now and you carry with you even today?
Creativity is a dime a dozen. You can be talented. It's not enough. You have to be disciplined, right? You have to get up, put in the hard work, and I think I learned that from my father every single day as he was trying to raise 4 kids in his teenage year, basically a teenager, trying to raise 4 kids. I'm the last one. My dad is in his 70s, and I'm 52. To give you a sense of how young they were. He got up every morning, ate the same lunch, a bologna sandwich on white bread with mayonnaise and mustard. Fixed the lunch, would sweat out his belts, in Mississippi heat, but he paid the bills, put food on the table, and made possible our dreams. So he would tell us all the time, you gotta put in the work. So no matter how talented you are, you gotta put in the work. There are a lot of talented basketball players out there, some better than some in the NBA, but they don't have the discipline to do the work necessary to achieve success. So I think, excellence tied to discipline is what I learned. Yeah, absolutely.
So that definitely resonates in the corporate world, where before you can do anything, you have to have that credibility, right? Which can only come from excellence and achievement, right? Point well made. I wanted to pivot, right? Because we were talking about here before we got on, this book here, which is very important. I think, and in thinking about your career, which has been, I guess, a meticulous examination and discussion of the dynamics of this American experience. And the book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its urgent lessons for our own, which I encourage everybody to go get and read. And as early as kind of the front jacket of the book, you issue a challenge for a new America. And with your permission and for the benefit of our audience, I wanted you to help us make an amendment to that call. And the question is, what would it take for us to call forth the new corporate America, one that acknowledges the trauma of racism and sexism, homophobia, and otherness, right? And provides Black men in corporate America with some level of acceptance and hope?
That's a really fascinating question for a variety of reasons. But I think the answer is aligned with the nation itself. We have to tell the truth about how we got here. That corporate America looks the way it looks because of deliberate choices over time. We tell ourselves the story about the US, right? As if racial inequality was the result of happenstance, it just happened to be this way. No. That's not what happened. It was deliberate choices. The vaunted American middle class came into existence during the context of the New Deal. What happened? Black folk systematically cut out, locked out in terms of banking policy, locked out in terms of education, locked out in terms of criminal justice, locked out residential segregation, school segregation, right? Deliberate policy produced the world that we inhabit today. Corporate America looks the way it looks because of deliberate choices. So if there's going to be a shift, one has to be as deliberate in changing the environment as one was in creating it. You can't just lift all boats. You have to become deliberate. So what does it mean to shift the way we think of corporate America and the way we think of America? Diversity has to become a constitutive feature of our practice, not some philanthropic gesture or charitable enterprise, as if you're doing a favor for me, because then you believe that you possess equality as yours to give to somebody else. Who are you to give me equality? No. So part of what we have to do in the context of corporate America is to begin to figure out how to operate where diversity is the constitutive value of who we are, right? And I was asked this question recently by some folks that I was talking with in you guys' area, right? And they were like, how do we measure success? How do we know when we succeeded? And I was like, that's an odd question. And she was like, well, what do you mean? I said, do you ask that question about any other area within the constitutive features of your business? As if there's a terminus, there are ongoing assessments. But when you think about Liberty Mutual, when you think about Deutsche Bank, when you think about Princeton University or Morehouse, right? What is the measure of success is never in the past tense. So when we think of diversity as constitutive of who we are, it's part of the ongoing practice of what we do. And that means from the top to the bottom, from the board to entry-level positions, we are evidencing our commitment, right? Evidence our commitment because it's constitutive of how we see ourselves. Once we do that, now we're in a different game because you're not doing anybody a favor. You're not responding to the fever of the current moment, but you're actually doing business in accordance to the values that you say you have. That's a different kind of orientation, it seems to me.
No, that's interesting, right? These issues are systemic and systematic, and they're very much part of the fabric of our culture, whether it's corporate or otherwise. But I want to push you a little bit, Eddie.
Sure.
We have almost 1,000 Black male executives here. A lot of them, thankfully, and I say so proudly, that can move the needle in corporate America, that can affect change, right? That can lift up others. Where might they start? How should they go about doing that? And I know you talked at Liberty Mutual before as well, right? So you know this corporate culture, you know the challenges. What does it take, and what should Black men do to make changes in this world?
Well, I mean, we don't want to generalize, right? The fact that someone is a Black male in leadership doesn't necessarily mean that that person is committed to a certain set of views that you and I may share, for example. So you don't want to just presume, right? So the question is a fascinating one, because you have folk who are out here for themselves. They have been grinding, hustling in light of their own ambition. And I get that, right? So we don't want to presume that just because someone is Black, that they, by definition, have an interest in a more diverse work environment. But what should we be doing? Well, I mean, look, it seems to me if you hold the view that diversity ought to be a constitutive value, inclusion and equity ought to be a constitutive value of the place that you work, it seems to me that you should be leveraging your capital to make that happen. That we can't quiet ourselves as we ascend in these spaces, because oftentimes the condition for our ascent is that we've had to mute ourselves. We can't bring the fullness of who we are to the table, right? Because the fullness of who we are could make people uncomfortable, right? So you had to be quiet. You couldn't show anger. You had to be very deliberate and very careful in exhibiting your brilliance and the like, right? But what does it mean to bring the fullness of who you are now that you've reached the places that you occupy? To bring the fullness of who you are into the workspace, and in some ways use that power to change the culture of the place from the top to the bottom. So I'm speaking at a certain existential level, Brother Ed, that we have to ask the question: why are you there in the first place? If you're there just for yourself, be honest. That's what you're there for. But if you're there fundamentally to open up space, one of the things that we must do is model what it means to bring the fullness of who we are to the workplace, right? I always use this example, and I know we don't have much time, so I got to be quick. When Cornel West retired from Princeton, Brother Ed, I wanted to give him this big party. Everybody was like, you can't throw a party for a retire. I said, I did one for Toni Morrison. I'm going to do one for Cornel West. So we threw the retirement party for Toni Morrison in New York at the Lincoln Jazz Center. So I wanted to throw this party for Cornel that represented the fullness of his personality, because he taught me. He said, you got to enter these spaces like a loose garment, right? You can't wear them as if they're constitutive of who you are. You got to wear them like a loose garment. So I said, I want to have music across the spectrum. So we invited. You walked in to hear classical music and gospel music and jazz and funk and hip hop, and we had Lupe Fiasco. But for the last act, Doc, I had Parliament Funkadelic. George Clinton came out on stage. We had invited the entire community to come in to share with us. And one of the ways that what we were trying to do in that moment is that here we are at the height of our careers at Princeton, being ourselves. And there's this moment when George Clinton goes, Dr. West, we're going to turn Princeton out, Dr. West. We're going to turn Princeton. And Cornel jumps on stage, sings, and all of Princeton is inhabiting the space that we created. What does it mean not to quiet yourself and to actually be fully who you are? And what that models for younger folk coming up in the ranks, and what that can do with your power to changing the very ways in which these institutions function.
Yeah. No, but thanks for sharing that anecdote. Very, very powerful. And I think, how much of that self, right, to your point, we're all at different points in our journey, in our careers, in terms of how much we want to bring after having had some modicum of success, right, in this difficult world. And I think it's something that deeply probably resonates with all of our audience. So thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
All right, I want to double click a little bit on Baldwin because you're a Baldwin scholar, so I want to go there with you. And your book, it's not a biography of Jimmy. It's not literary criticism or history. It's an amalgamation of all those things, right? And I think in that way, it parallels him, right? Because he wasn't just an activist or a poet or essayist either. And in just hearing you speak at other functions or going through the book, right, it's obvious that his life and his workings resonate deeply with you.
Right.
So what is it about his work and about him that resonates so much with you, and especially is so relevant for folks in this day and age?
Wow, it's multi-layered, but I think it's deeply rooted in his demand for honesty. When I started writing the book, I was having trouble, besides drinking too much. Whenever Jimmy is an exacting companion, so I was drinking too much Irish whiskey, too much Jameson and Redbreast, right? But the sentences weren't jumping. They weren't jumping off the page. And it had something, and I realized, and then I remember hearing Jimmy's voice, like clearly saying to me, well, if we're going to do this together, old boy, you're going to have to deal with you. And so I had to come to terms with the fact that I'm still this scared little boy who has daddy issues. And once I engaged in that self-examination, suddenly the sentences started jumping off the page. I was free, right, to be me, to be vulnerable. Baldwin says, run towards your fear. Don't run away from it. Run towards it. Sit in it, right? So that you can then imagine yourself otherwise. You got to accept that in order to be able to leave it behind. Because if you don't accept it, you're going to be firmly docked at the station in some ways, right? So I think his demand for a certain kind of honesty and risk. Baldwin is the most insightful critic we've ever produced about American democracy and race. This short, queer Black man would speak truth to power straight, no chase. Didn't care. He should have won the Nobel Prize, but he knew the cost of what it would mean to embrace those young kids who started crying Black power. He knew the cost. He did it anyway. And so I think there is this sense in which this honesty with himself and this demand to bear witness, no matter the cost, just attracted me to him. And particularly in Begin Again, Brother Ed, it's the later Baldwin that's at the heart of the book. Because we tend to go to Fire Next Time or Notes of a Native Son. They say the later Baldwin, no, he's too bitter, he's too angry, right? And I'm going, no, you can't, you gotta deal with his rage, because that's him being honest with it. So that's what attracts me to him. He lives a life of introspection. He understands what it means to say that the unexamined life is not worth living, and to use that as the ground to say something about the world, because he basically holds this view: the messiness of the world is actually a reflection of the messiness of our interior lives. If we deal with all of this junk in us, then maybe we can say something honest about what all the messiness of the world that we inhabit.
And that's, I think, what's different with him. It's that I'm in order to say something relevant about the world around me. And in some ways, it's affirming in a way, right? Because you bring it back to kind of society around you, what's around you, and being constructive in a way.
Mm-hmm.
That's powerful. I want to pull in a question here from our audience that
Sure.
I think is relevant to the last two questions we've been batting around. And how did Baldwin regroup after 1968, and what can we learn from that example of perseverance, which I think you started to touch on there as you were going into kind of the later Baldwin?
Yeah, how did he regroup after 68? I write about this in the book. When they killed King, Baldwin is basically asking that Toni Morrison question: what are these people? That's what Stampede in the novel Beloved, when he pulls the scalp of a dead baby out of the water, out of the river, he asks, what are these people? My God. And Baldwin is grabbed, they killed the apostle of love. What does it say about the United States, right? And in 69, he tries to commit suicide. But he had to get himself together. So he goes and finds this elsewhere. And his elsewhere is in Istanbul, where he's not Jimmy Baldwin, he's not famous, right? And it's there that he tries to write, where he succeeds in finishing No Name in the Street, which is this account of this movement, this extraordinary expression of civic energy, of the heroism of everyday ordinary Black folk and the country's betrayal. And it's published in 72. So Baldwin picks up the pieces by bearing witness. And this is at the heart of the book, right? So the quote, the title of the book comes from his last novel, Just Above My Head. He says, and it comes from this moment in the novel where the civil rights movement has collapsed. King is dead. He says the dream has been slaughtered. Everybody scatters. Some have lost their minds. Some are dead. Some have left the country. Some have taken the bribe.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, but responsibility is not lost. Responsibility is abdicated. And if one refuses abdication, then one begins again. So it sounds Sisyphean, right? Well, you're just rolling the boulder up the hill. No, but what you see is that it's Talib Kweli's beautiful struggle, that it's the beautiful struggle that's the end. And so Baldwin picks up the pieces and bears witness. That's how he did it. But he was always fragile, man. Always seeming like he's on the verge of collapse. Bayard Rustin said he didn't know how he survived it all. He would come off the stage literally shaking, right? But he was a witness. So how did he survive? Well, I got to pick up the pieces of my own self. But then as a witness, we have to pick up the pieces of all of us. I'm going to tell a story that allows us to muster the courage to push this damn boulder up a hill again. And I'll say this really quickly. I started writing Begin Again because I kept saying to myself, these damn white folks have done it again. Here we are coming out of 8 years of Obama, all the stuff they were talking, and they're going to elect this dude? And it felt as if it felt and feels like the country, at least portions of the country, losing their minds. And I'm going, damn, they're betraying us again. They're doing it again. And now my baby has to grow up in this. His babies have to deal with this. And so I was trying to figure out a way to bear witness in the midst of a betrayal, in the midst of my own disillusionment and despair. That's what I think he did.
Some powerful lessons there, Eddie, for our audience here. And I'm looking at some of the questions coming in for us. I want to bring us, as we're going back, to bring us forward again. And you talked about taking the bribe. You talked about how we all show up, right? And how authentic we feel like we can be. And you shared your own personal experience on Cornel West's retirement party. But what I wanted to hit on now was, what do you see as the contemporary barriers to diversity, equity, and inclusion within a corporate context? How have those changed, or, what should we be anticipating at this point where so many eyes are on us, right? Especially in the last 12 months, post George Floyd, post Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor.
Yeah, I think the biggest barrier is the framework, the way in which we approach DEI. I made a distinction. It went by really quickly, I think. But when we address racial equality as a philanthropic enterprise, as a charitable gesture, then it orients us in a particular sort of way to the problem. It's not seen as constitutive, but additive. I'm doing this for you. Baldwin at a congressional hearing with Betty Shabazz said, I'm skeptical of white liberals. This is the late Baldwin in the 70s. I'm skeptical of white liberals. And he says, I'm skeptical of people who want to do something for me as opposed to with me. Right? It's an important distinction. But at the heart of the skepticism is something that King said, and where do we go? Dr. King said, and where do we go from here? That we think of racial justice philanthropically. As I'm going to write the check, we do this. We hold our, George Floyd happened. we're trying to figure out how do we manage all the tension. We have all the events, we're going to lean in, and then we turn our attention back to business as usual, right? And so I think the biggest obstacle for us, not only within corporate America, but within American higher education, the country generally, right, is this philanthropic orientation, the framing. We have to shift the center of gravity, that we don't see people of color and Black men in particular, right, as ornaments, but as key players in the success of our endeavors. That we know that the data is clear, that when you have a more diverse leadership team, you have better outcomes. We know that when you have a diversity at every level, that you succeed. And you know that you can't play on a global landscape, keeping half your talent on the sidelines. We know this. So if you're being honest with yourselves, you got to ask yourself, what's holding us back? The talent has always been there. It's right there in front of your face, right? So we have to change the frame. Oftentimes we're tinkering around the edges and not getting to the heart of the matter. Because once we get at the heart of the matter, now we're doing something a little bit more substantive, and then we're on dangerous ground because folk get uncomfortable when you start getting to the heart of the matter.
Well said there. I want to come back to the book one last time here.
Sure.
Sure. You talked about Baldwin in his conversation with student activists. I want to double click on that. You know, in that conversation, or in those conversations, he makes a pledge to them that, you know, if they never accept the reductive and degrading things that are said about Black people, that he would never betray them. Right. And just a second ago, I think you did a wonderful job of talking about kind of corporate America, what it needs to do, what we have to do from kind of a macro DEI lens, right, to make this world something different, to make corporate America something different. Maybe more pointedly to the folks on the phone here, is there an analogous pledge that Black men should make to corporate America and to each other that we should highlight for folks?
Yeah. I said it to my son. I say it to myself over and over again. The world conspires to make you small. The question is whether or not you're going to be complicit. The world conspires to make you small. And the question is whether you're going to make yourself complicit, whether you're going to be complicit. And what I mean by that is I've already talked about be quiet and mute yourself. Right? What is Baldwin says, I don't know, he said in the Uses of the Blues, he said, I don't know what you think the Negro problem is. But what it is for that quote unquote Negro parent, right, is that we have to raise our children in a world that despises him. And we have to raise them in a way that they don't despise themselves. What does it mean to put a crown above your head and to grow into it? So I'm of the mindset that the thing that we need to say, the days of us dancing, our complicity with the world as it's currently arranged has to be over. I want to bring the fullness of who I am to the table. You can't deny my bibliography when I'm on MSNBC. I'm bringing the fullness of what I've read to the table. You're going to have to deal with the fact that I can go from Whitman to Shakespeare to Bobby Blue Bland. You're going to have to deal with me. So the thing is, if the world conspires to make us small, the question is whether we're going to be complicit. And if you're not going to be complicit, then what the hell are you going to do? And my answer has always been to my son and to me, I'm going to do what Coltrane did in Giant Steps. When you listen to Giant Steps, the introduction, that introductory solo is so complex, the pianist didn't know what to do. He had never heard it before in his life. And so he just starts fumbling with the keys. So if you're not gonna be complicit in the world that makes you small, then take giant steps, right? So our agreement that Baldwin made to those young folk, because he saw that they were tired. He knew that just 2 years later, he saw what was on the horizon. He knew that these kids, Stokely Carmichael, Cortland Cox, Muriel Tillinghast, that they would end up screaming Black Power because they had seen raw terror. And he says, if you don't believe what these people say about you, I'll never betray you. And what are they saying? Black is beautiful. I'm beautiful. I'm powerful, right? So if we're going to change this world, we're going to have to stop being complicit with it as it is currently arranged. I'm going to bring the fullness of who I am into any room. And that doesn't mean I'm angry. That doesn't mean that I'm hard to get along, that I have rough edges, but I'm not going to quiet my genius. And you ought not to quiet yours either.
You could almost let that one sit for a minute, you know, and then bringing that into a room and kind of in a way that, and if I can kind of extrapolate a little bit, right, in a way that continues to be constructive while still making a point, while still showing who you are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid of me. If you're afraid of me being me, then you need to interrogate your fears. But that doesn't mean that I have to quiet myself. No more. Those days are over.
Well said, and thanks for indulging me that last question on the book.
Sure.
Shifting gear a little bit, and then I want to open it back up to questions from the audience.
Sure.
Coming back to the historical context here, where we're talking about history. I'm a history major myself, so I appreciate this. And history, repeats itself, or maybe it reinvents itself over time. But in any event, it does matter. Share with us some of the important lessons that history does teach us about the rules and perils of Black men in leadership.
Yeah, it's. I wanted just three things really quickly. One involves the dangers of the bride. Each of us faces the danger of the bride daily. That we get caught up in our bank accounts, in our material possessions, in the allure of success, and we find ourselves in those spaces making choices that can very well corrode the soul, and then we become complicit with the world as it is. So be aware of the dangers of the bride. The second point, which follows from it, are the pitfalls of cowardliness. What does it mean to find yourself in leadership positions where you become brokers, where you're just giving people crumbs, where you're afraid to speak truth in the moment, even though you've worked your behinds off, you have the leverage, but you are afraid. You're afraid to speak your mind, right? So the pitfalls of cowardliness are rooted in your inability to conquer your fears. And then that means you become that kind of leader that sustains the status quo as opposed to being transformative. And then the third component, we talked about the dangers of the bride, the pitfalls of cowardliness, but the necessity of courage in moments of profound crises. The nation stands at a crossroads. Democracy is on a knife's edge. Corporate America understands this. We saw that Black CEOs and Black leaders write that wonderful letter about voting and the like. This country is on a knife's edge. What is required is courage, a willingness to risk everything in this moment, right now. Because if we don't make the right choice in this moment, I don't know if this place is going to survive. I really don't. That's not hyperbole. That's history speaking. So those are the three areas: the dangers of the bride, the pitfalls of cowardliness, and the necessity for courage. Being aware of the first two and enacting the third, that is the source of leadership in this moment.
Hope all our brothers took those three down. Okay, so some good lessons there and good takeaways. Let's add a little positivity here. What does history teach us about these joys and opportunities that Black men have in leadership, and where can they use that and channel that, right, to save this society and democracy from this knife's edge that you just told us we were on?
Oh my God, man! When we put our minds to something, I mean, the brilliance of our creativity, the historical record is replete with what happens when we take advantage of our opportunities. When we step into the fullness of who we are, we can transform the world. We have. We continue to do so. So Baldwin, said in 1970, hope is invented every day. Even in the midst of the darkness, hope is invented every day. And that formulation comes out of an understanding, an intimate understanding that we are blues people. What does that mean? That means that if hope has to be invented every day, that means we're holding off despair. We're trying to figure out how to get up in the morning. So if hope is invented every day, we bring the fullness of our creativity, our energy, in imagining a new world. So I have faith in us. Baldwin put it this way after they killed King. He said, human beings are disasters and miracles. We have to protect ourselves from the disasters that we've become. And then I'll riff on it in this way. But if we show up in the fullness of who we are, then we have a chance for a miracle, right? So we need to just show up today in this moment, right? Risk everything in this moment for not only for a new America, but, as Baldwin would say, for our babies, for our babies.
I'll say this, Eddie, because one, it recalls how you opened. Two, because I kid you not, but it's one of the family models for me and my 4 children, right? You got to put in the work. You got to put in the work in order to affect change. And as you said, right, we're replete with examples in our history, right, of having done so.
Yeah, the crown is above our heads, right? Indeed. It's always been there. It's always been there.
Indeed. I think we have time maybe for one more question here from the audience. Sure. So let's see what we have here. Coming back to the point of digging deeper into ourselves, how can we reinforce the concept of introspection and vulnerability? And I think that was part of the conversation we sat in there at the end from the previous session, right? Especially within men.
I think this is really an important point. In Baldwin's essay he wrote called Freaks and the Ideal of American Manhood, published in Playboy around 1985. He wants to challenge this notion of masculinity, that straitjackets who we are, right? That this notion of masculinity that has produced cowboys and Indians, right? That has produced, our Marvel heroes and the like. For my dad's generation, it was John Wayne. For my son's generation, it's Captain America, I suppose, right? But this idea of manhood has reproduced so much toxicity in the body, in the social body. And it keeps us from understanding the importance of vulnerability, of confronting our own fears. The fact, as I said, I told you, I had to deal with the fact that I'm a vulnerable little boy. And I had to deal with that in order to raise my son. Otherwise, I was going to repeat all the junk that my dad did to me. I ended up doing some of it. I tried to break it in some areas. But if we don't undo this notion of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, right? We will be, these categories will choke the life out of us. So Baldwin, way ahead of his time, he would probably have different pronouns, right? He resisted being called a homosexual, right? His sexuality, right? Resisted in so many ways categorization, right? We have to figure out how to bring the fullness of the complexity of who we are to the table as men. And that requires of us to leave behind the straitjacket of the stereotypes of what a man is supposed to be. It seems to me. Oh my God, that would release us into being so much more, wouldn't it? Yeah. I got to convince my wife of that.
I think we all struggle with that, not just at home, but at work too. Now it's I think part of what's difficult is that because, and I think we touched on this earlier, right? There are representation issues. There's a lack of role models in this corporate America that, for historical reasons, and you alluded to them all, right? And we know them well, have corporate America looking the way it does. So for a lot of us coming up, right, you think you have to fit in a certain box and be a certain way. And, you know, as you so eloquently said, right, we have to break that mold and be willing to show up in that way.
Yeah.
In our fullness. Yeah. So it's,
the dance requires two partners. Let's stop dancing. Yeah.
I like that. I like that. Eddie, I think we're just about at time.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to leave our folks with?
No, you know, I just think, you know, we're on the precipice of change. And in the history of the country, whenever we found ourselves in this moment, it has doubled down on its ugliness and betrayed it. We're in a moment where we can actually imagine a new America. Let's not let the country betray it again. That's the key.
Eddie, thank you so much. It's been truly a pleasure unpacking all of these learnings for our audience, and I think there's so much here that folks can take away and kind of put into practice, you know, immediately, and not just at work, right? Because the home life matters too, right?
Indeed.
Well, for our folks in the audience, thank you so much for listening to us. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And I hope that you come away with a lot of tangible action items here to take away and deploy into your kind of personal and professional lives. Eddie, thank you again so much. It's been truly a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you. And stay safe, Doc. Take care.
Thank you.